Hi guys, this is Michael from Chess Knowledge, and today we are going to be revisiting one of the most iconic chess matches in history between Garry Kasparov, playing as white, against Veselin Topalov, playing as black, which took place in 1999. Let's get started with the game. So, Kasparov starts off with e4, and right off the bat, Topalov tries to throw off Kasparov with the pawn d6 move. Now, this is quite unusual as far as Topalov's openings go, and essentially what he's trying to do here is he's trying to prevent any opening ideas that Kasparov has. So we have d4, followed by knight f6, followed by knight c3, then g6, and bishop e3. Bishop g7, followed by queen d2, pawn c6, pawn f3, and then pawn to b5. We now have knight to e2, followed by knight to d7, and then bishop h6. Topalov then captures the bishop, of which Kasparov captures the bishop on h6. Now, this isn't too much of a bad move for Kasparov, as what this essentially does is it prevents Topalov from castling kingside. We then have bishop to b7, pawn a3, pawn e5, and then Kasparov castles queenside. Queen to e7, preparing castle queenside for Topalov. We have king b1, just protecting the king a little bit better. We then have pawn to a6, knight to c1. So what Kasparov is trying to do is he's trying to get that knight over to a5, as the pawn to a6 move has made a nice square there for the knight to sit in at a5. Topalov castles queenside. We have knight b3. Once again, Kasparov going for the a5 square. We have pawn captures on b3. Pawn captures on d4. My apologies. We then have rook captures, followed by pawn to c5. And then Kasparov retreats this rook back to d1. We then have knight b6, followed by pawn g3. Now, what this move does is essentially the move here that Kasparov is hoping for is opening up the diagonal for the bishop to go to h3. So we have king to b8, knight a5. Finally, Kasparov is getting to that square that he is targeting. Bishop a8, just preventing the threat of the knight on the bishop. Bishop to h3, so Kasparov carries on with his idea of going for that diagonal. And then we have pawn to d5. Kasparov then goes for queen to f4 with a check. We have king a7, and then rook to e1. Pawn d4, and then knight to d5. Now, this move here forks the queen as well as with the two knights, and it's also offering an exchange of knights. So Topalov takes up the exchange of knights and he captures on d5, followed by pawn capturing on d5. We then have queen to d6, offering an exchange of queens, and then Kasparov goes for rook captures on d4. Now, this rook sacrifice is actually what makes this game so famous. This is what eventually won Kasparov the game, and in post-analysis you can always see that the exchange should have been denied by Topalov, but he does capture the rook on d4. We then have rook to e7 check, followed by king to b6, and then queen captures on d4 check. King captures the knight on a5, and then pawn to b4 check. King to a4, and then queen to c3. Now this is a dangerous position for Topalov to be in, as queen to b3 is threatening a checkmate. So what Topalov does is he captures the pawn on d5 to protect that b3 square against the checkmate. We then have rook to a7. This is now there's a double threat in player, so rook to a6 capturing the pawn would also be a checkmate. So Topalov defends with bishop to b7, rook captures, and then queen to c4. We then have queen captures on the knight on f6, and then king captures on a3 as these pawns are now undefended, so Topalov starts to take down the structure. Queen captures on a6 check, then followed by king captures on b4, pawn to c3. Now this pawn can't be taken out with the queen, otherwise it leaves the king stranded. Queen to b5 would be a check and there'd be no defense to it, and following a few series it would actually result in checkmate, so it has to be captured with the king. We have queen to a1 and king to d2, followed by queen b2 check, and then king to d1. Now this bishop here on the strong diagonal hasn't played much of a role in this game yet. Although its presence was known, it hasn't played much of a role. But this is where it comes into effect quite strongly. So Kasparov plays bishop to f1. Now the queen cannot run from this position. It can never leave that position, otherwise queen to e2 would be checkmate. Okay, so Topalov plays rook to d2, and then rook to d7 played by Kasparov. So what this essentially does is it is pinning the rook, so it cannot capture the queen on b2. And then we have rook captures on d7, followed by bishop captures the queen on c4. We then have pawn captures and queen captures on h8, taking back the castle. We then have rook to d3, followed by queen a8, and then pawn to c3. Now Topalov's trying to queen this pawn here, so Kasparov plays queen to a4 check. He then plays king e1, and then pawn f4, preventing any other further development on that side, and then pawn to f5, putting the king in check. Kasparov plays king c1, preventing any ideas for queening pawn, and then rook to d2, and then queen to a7. At this point, Topalov resigned the game. Reason being is because the pawn structure on Topalov's side, the f7, h7, and g6 pawns, the queen would be able to take out fairly easy, and Topalov cannot capture with the castle, otherwise it will be a simple move to just take out the castle. So at this point, Topalov resigned the game. So I just want to thank everyone for watching the video. If you would like to see more videos from Chess Knowledge, then please like and subscribe. I've been Michael, and have yourself a great day.